many types of London bus of the 20th century, one stands out as a design classic. Between 1939 and 1954, almost 7,000 RT-type buses were built for service in London and the surrounding countryside. There were more RTs built than any other London bus before or since. A design ahead of its time when it first appeared, the RT has now become part of London's history.
London, as you know, is quite a special case for buses. There's an awful lot of urban driving in high density traffic, and that puts quite a strain on any public service vehicle. Even today, it's quite unlike a lot of other cities where you've got short stretches of urban driving and then quite a lot perhaps in suburban or out even into the country where a bus can just cruise along happily in top gear. It's not like that in London. It's all stop-start, lots of braking, lots of accelerating. So this all started out with a B-type in 1910 when the LGOC had just beaten off a lot of competition from rivals, and they inherited a very mixed bag of vehicles from all sorts of small companies. And they had quite a nightmare on their hands keeping all these vehicles maintained and on the road. And their engineer, Frank Searle, came up with this notion of developing their own vehicle which would not only be standardised but specifically designed to cope with London's particular problems. Searle's solution was to build the B-type, which was a great success, and it drew on a lot of contemporary practice. And the London General Omnibus Company from that day forward adhered more and more closely to this notion of a purpose-built bus for London and a standardised fleet. The whole thing took a step forward again in the 20s when they transferred the maintenance operation from individual garages to the centralised overhaul works at Chiswick. They realised that they could save quite a lot of time, operating time, by dispatching a bus on a routine basis to Chiswick, where it would be completely stripped, inspected, all its parts overhauled, and then the vehicle reassembled and put back on the road, virtually as a brand new vehicle. And that was quite an important step, and also favoured the idea of standardised vehicles, of course, because then they could do everything on a flow line principle. Bring the buses in, take them to bits, refurb, put them back together again. So that was really the guiding philosophy for a very long time on the bus side.
When London Transport was formed in 1933, it inherited a mixed fleet of buses from the London General Omnibus Company and the various independent operators, even though the general buses were more or less standardised. The intention now was to work towards a standard bus which could be built in thousands and eventually take over all London services.
In 1929, the Associated Equipment Company, which was the chassis manufacturing concern owned by the Underground Group and actually therefore directly related to the LGOC, brought out a new range of models, not originally in response to a London General request, but they were proved to be outstandingly successful. And in the early 30s, the LGOC standardised on these. There was the T-type single-decker and then the ST double-decker. T was the basic type, ST stood for short T basically, but they were a common design. They remained petrol-engined through their lives in London, these particular types. Very basically conventional, but with a much more lively six-cylinder petrol engine which gave a much better performance than earlier types of London bus, and they also proved to be very reliable and well thought of by passengers. From this standardised range of the T and ST, which incidentally AEC called the Regal, which was the single-decker, and the Regent, which was the double-decker, evolved a whole family of types, and the STL type bus, which came a little later, was slightly longer, but still basically the Regent. One of the features which London found was very desirable was an easier kind of gear change. These earlier types of bus had the old conventional crash gearbox, and the poor driver had a very hard time changing gear continuously and operating the clutch. And it was found that the Daimler pre-selector gearbox and fluid flywheel was a much better combination, and the STL type buses standardised on this, and that was another basis for future development.
But life for a London bus driver in the 1930s had its problems.
We are not striking for more money, but for something of more value to ourselves and families, our health. Gastritis is the busman's enemy, an illness for which arid and irregular meals are responsible.
That's right, I've just had 16 weeks off for an operation.
AEC and London Transport worked closely together. The Associated Equipment Company was now an independent commercial vehicle builder, but an agreement had been made for them to supply the majority of buses for London Transport, primarily chassis, with bodies built at Chiswick. The chief bus of the 1930s was the STL, the culmination of the design philosophy of the London General Omnibus Company. Built in large numbers, it incorporated a wholesale change from petrol to diesel-engined buses, bringing substantial savings on fuel costs.
When LPTP was formed, there was a policy of standardisation or working towards it, and the STL class of vehicle over the years underwent not heavy modification or changes, but gradually it changed. And then in 1938 it was decided that they'd gone as far as they could with the STL, and it was decided then to start another breed, if you like, which became known as the 2RT. One prototype was built at the AEC, and a body was built in the experimental shop at Chiswick, and the two were put together, though for a time the chassis ran with like a dummy body from an old vehicle, so that people didn't really know what was going on. And after the prototype did its trials, it was then decided to build 150 of them with Chiswick bodies, and AEC produced chassis.
The RT chassis was required to offer powerful acceleration and smooth braking, easy gear changes and automatic chassis lubrication. London Transport was convinced that a Daimler-type pre-select gear change, but operated by air pressure, would give the optimum combination of comfort and durability. And their experience with the large-engined Leyland STD confirmed the belief that a large engine, D-rated, was a better philosophy than a small engine working hard. In the late 1930s, London Transport was a world leader in transport design. Its publicity, its underground and stations were far ahead of its contemporaries. For its new design of double-deck bus, London Transport was to seek a highly standardised fleet of vehicles offering unsurpassed ease of driving, maintenance and passenger comfort.
When RT1 first came out in 1939, the effect was quite dramatic because the appearance was quite different to any London bus that had gone before. I was a 13-year-old schoolboy at the time and well remember the copy of the paper with the photograph in it and the impact it made, and it's something I've been interested in ever since. The body design was clean looking, practical in the sense of being easy to clean, but also in line with modern ideas on appearance, and certainly keeping up the London Transport standard of the best. In other words, that it should be in conformity with their high standards in architecture and everything else.
The war came along and that stopped production. A lot of the stuff on the pre-war RTs was German air pressure equipment, and it was difficult to get. And it wasn't possible to get as much mileage out of these vehicles because of the difficulty of getting spares, and small fleets are difficult to service. So some of them came off the road.
The design of the body on RT1 was very largely metal framed and quite advanced at the time. London Transport had built most of its bus bodies in its own workshops at Chiswick up to 1939. This body was built there, and so were the production vehicles. The manufacturing plant wasn't equipped for metal frame bodywork at that time, and it was decided that this first production batch of 150 would have timber framing, but in fact the body of RT1 was nearer what London Transport wanted.
Well, also Chiswick changed its output. It became involved in London Aircraft Productions, which was to produce Handley Page Halifax bombers in conjunction with several other people, Dupel, Express Motor Bodies, Park Royal and so on, and therefore bus building virtually came to an end. And London learnt quite a bit about aircraft production, jig construction, because it was always thought that it would be better to have bodies that are interchangeable with chassis and so on, because it takes longer to overhaul a body, a week longer, than it does a chassis. And therefore, when we bought vehicles, we used to perhaps buy 100 buses and 5 extra bodies. The idea was that the bodies would have to be interchangeable with the chassis, and therefore when the body was built it was checked on a jig to see that it lined up with the fixing on the chassis was jigged so that there was no problem of dropping another body onto that particular chassis.
It was decided immediately after the war that Chiswick would be incapable of dealing with the numbers of vehicles that would need to be overhauled after the war. And they addressed that in the best possible way by going for a completely purpose-built workshop to deal with the standard RT fleet that was being delivered. Fortuitously, they had a large works available at Aldenham, which had been set up for the northern extensions of the underground lines. And those underground lines had been planned in the 30s under the new works programme, and they would have been built, and the works at Aldenham would have served the underground routes. Had it not been for the creation of the Green Belt, planning laws moved on a great deal in the later years of the war, and the creation of the Green Belt meant that housing wasn't going to grow up in those areas. Without the suburban housing, the underground lines couldn't be justified, so they weren't built, although some of the earthworks for them had been built, but they had this huge works on their hands. What were they going to use it for? And with some adaptation, it was able to be used as a bus works.
They're familiar sights in London now, these new RT buses, and more are coming on the road every day. There are well over 3,000 in service already. Generally speaking, every bus is identical, and a body made by one firm will fit the chassis made by another. A resident London Transport Inspector works in each factory where the buses are made to see that the manufacturer keeps to the London Transport specifications, and the buses go through a number of tests even before they leave the factory. Quite early in their lives, for instance, they are tested to see that they won't get in the rain. But it's when they're delivered to the London Transport Works at Aldenham that they're really put through it. London Transport staff and a Ministry of Transport inspector go over every bus to see that it agrees in every way with the Ministry of Transport regulations. It mustn't be too high or too low. Its width and length must be exact, so these are accurately marked on the ground to be measured later. Gangway space and the space between seats is very important. Checking all these measurements ensures that within very narrow limits, every bus is identical. But it's not only the dimensions of the bus that have to be exact. Every bus must be mechanically perfect. A London Transport fitter, watched by the Ministry of Transport representatives, inspects selected parts of the bus to see that they're sound and up to standard. Every bus goes through every one of these tests, so the Ministry inspector knows that each individual vehicle is satisfactory. Lastly, the buses are weighed, and the first one of each new type to be delivered to London Transport goes through a tilting test. The result of this can be taken as a standard for every bus of that type. Indicators are fixed onto the bus to show the angle of tilt, and safety ropes are put round it as a precaution. But on the actual tilt itself, there is nothing holding the bus onto the ramp. This test makes sure that the bus will hold the road under conditions far worse than anything it is liable to meet in service. It's only when each bus has been tested and passed, and has been approved by the Ministry Inspector that it's certified as fit to operate as a public service vehicle. The new RTs, guaranteed safe and sound, leave Aldenham to join their garages, where they'll play their part in carrying some of the thousands of passengers who travel every day on London's buses.
In 1947 I started after the army and went to trams driving. We was on the route through the tunnel, the Kingsway subway, 78 Victoria to Norwood, and a general run around London on the trams, 48s to that. After that we went to the buses, started at Stockwell.
May I have 2 on the 2s, please?
2 on the 2s.
Thank you.
See you outside now.
Right.
And from there we was on the 2s, the 2As, 78s, and then after that on the ones to Crystal Palace, Golders Green, Hyde Park Corner, Baker Street, Golders Green, Swiss Cottage, North Finchley. And at times it took you an hour and a half from Victoria to Stockwell, which was normally a 10-minute run on account of the traffic, and you was really, stuck in the queue. Nothing you could do apart from wait.
This is the East Anglia Transport Museum at Carlton Colville, just outside Lowestoft, where we as a group of volunteers over the past 25 years or so have created a museum including a street scene where, amongst many other vehicles, we run London trams and trolleybuses. The relevance of these to the RT story is, of course, that RTs replace both. The RT, in its post-war concept, was designed and built as London's first totally standardised bus fleet, an aim which London Transport had sought, in fact, since it was formed in 1933, which it finally achieved in the mid-1950s. The first task of the large RT family, when it was built from 1947 onwards, in the early post-war years, was to replace the worst of the bus fleets that was inherited from pre-war times. This was principally the old LT and ST classes, but also many of the STLs also. These vehicles had outlived their working life in many cases, and the great majority of them were in very poor structural condition. During the war years, the timber bodywork had deteriorated tremendously, and although a good deal of money was spent in post-war times extensively renovating many of them, particularly the STLs, the timber which was used was itself not very good, and it only projected a further 4 or 5 years' life, which meant that by about 1954, the whole of the pre-war and indeed the wartime utility fleet would have to be replaced. The RTs then, between 1947 and 1949, were used to replace the whole of the older type vehicles in the fleet. From 1950 onwards, tramway replacement began. The RTs were also ordered in bulk to replace the whole of the remaining tram system. Before the war, the principle had been to replace trams with trolleybuses. It was a sensible move because it made use of the electrical infrastructure, and it was certainly a cheaper arrangement at the time than replacing with motor buses. After the war, though, much of the pre-war trolleybus system was halfway through its lifespan, and the economics of electric power had in any case changed. The situation had arrived where it was now proving no cheaper to run trolleybuses than it was motor buses. In fact, London Transport's own examination of the subject in about 1950 showed that the running costs of both were equal. It took 2 years, from October 1950 through to the middle of 1952, to replace the tram fleet, using almost entirely brand new RTs. Only on the last conversion were other vehicles used in order to bring the conversion forward somewhat. Once that was finished, the RTs then were used to sweep away the remnants of the non-standard bus fleet, which then consisted of the wartime vehicles, wartime utilities, the remaining STLs, and the non-standard post-war vehicles, STDs and Daimlers and so on, that had been bought in 1946 when the purchase of non-standard new rolling stock was inevitable.
In 1946, the war-damaged RT-97 was rebuilt as an experimental pay-as-you-board bus, but it caused many delays for people getting on board and was withdrawn a year later. The post-war RT now had all-metal body construction. Park Royal and Weyman went on to build 5,380 of the 6,820 post-war RT bodies. These new buses resembled the pre-war RTs, except for losing the rear roof number box, the sloping cab windows, and tapered rear corner panel. And they had new front destination screens. The RTs were the largest fleet of standardised buses anywhere in the world. But demand for sufficient bodies brought some necessary diversity. Metro Camel of Birmingham, Saunders of Anglesey, and Cravens of Sheffield were all contracted to supply bodies to fit the RT-type chassis. These went into service from 1948 onwards. This Saunders RT is still at work for Unitrans in Davis, California. Unitrans runs 6 RTs. All the drivers and conductors are student volunteers, and the red flag is necessary for the safety of passengers alighting and boarding, since the rear platform is, obviously, the far side from the pavement.
London Transport needed vehicles quickly, and it was decided to farm out the bodybuilding side of it to different companies. Cravens went along with London Transport some of the way and then decided to build the Cravens to their own sort of fashion. And the differences between the Cravens and standard RTs, and the Saunders and the ones built by Weyman and Park Royal vary greatly. The interior is totally different to any RT. The obvious difference is the 5-bay windows, which was a standard sort of practice of that period.
Well, then we had a surplus of bodies a bit later on. It always goes like that. And we did a conversion of some STL chassis and produced about 150 what we called SRTs. We remade the chassis to take the RT type body. It wasn't successful and we didn't proceed with it.
The SRT proved to be the one major mistake in the RT programme. Its converted STL chassis was underpowered and its braking inadequate. Following strong complaints from drivers, the decision was taken to order additional new RT chassis. The still new SRT bodies were then transferred and the converted STL chassis was sold for scrap. Also in 1948, the first of over 1,600 chassis from Leyland went into service with standard RT bodies. The only visible difference of these new RTLs being the new shape Leyland radiator at the front. By the end of 1948, the mass replacement of London's bus fleet was in full swing, with 755 RTs of various types entering service. In 1949, an experimental RT coach entered Green Line service, the RTC. It was none other than the previously unsuccessful pay-as-you-board RT-97, and it was again to prove unsuccessful. 1949 also saw the 8-foot-wide Leyland RTW introduced.
People were talking about 8-foot-wide buses, all up to date had been 7'6". We'd done trials around London. We'd built a dummy body to 8 foot. 8 foot was chosen because that was the next clean imperial size. So we got permission from the Metropolitan Police and City Police to have 500 8-foot wide buses, which we called RTWs. And then we did an experiment with routes converging on Piccadilly Circus, High Street Kensington, well, that was always a favourite dodge, so that we changed all the allocations over so that they were swamped with the 8-foot wide buses, you know, for 3 months or so. But anyway, we got a clean bill of health out of that from the police, and we put the RTWs into central service and used the other ones more on the outskirts.
This is a model of the wide version of the RT bus, the RTW. The W in this case stands for wide, and the model you're looking at is a model of the actual bus that you can see here. The extra 6 inches of width was made up on the inside of the bus by 1-inch spacers, which were placed between the seats and the interior panels on both sides of the vehicle, leaving an extra 4 inches in the gangway. This was very useful for the conductors in central London. The conductors of the RTW liked the extra width. It gave them more room when there were standing passengers on board. However, they were not quite so popular with the drivers. The drivers found them a little bit heavier steering. We think it's probably to do with the extra width and the extra weight, the RTW being over 8 tonnes as compared with the RT and RTL 7.5 tonnes.
In August 1950, a number of new RTs were delivered for use on Green Line routes in East London. These buses were no different from other RTs, but were given a distinctive appearance by being kept free of advertisements and by being fitted with a Green Line bullseye symbol. In later years, further Green Line RTs were provided, while many ordinary RTs were used on Green Line services during busy summer weekends.
If you talk about London transport, everybody immediately thinks of great fleets of red buses thundering round London. They totally forget that for many years there was a great fleet of green buses thundering round the outside of London. They served the entire area of Essex, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and in the south they covered Kent, Surrey and Sussex, and they poked into Berkshire and they sort of wandered here, there and everywhere. Some of these routes were extremely rural. But the RTs first came into the green area back in July 1948 at Hemel Hempstead and Tring in the northwest. And from then on they took over all the double-deck workings, more or less, with a small exception. And they ran through the new towns and through the countryside and proved to be a very satisfactory vehicle.
This is one of the fleet of Green Line buses introduced to Romford in August of 1950. These were used extensively on the busy East London routes, the 721 and the 722, running from Brentwood and Upminster to Aldgate. The passengers must have found these buses very luxurious compared with the buses they went on before, which were Daimler wartime. They were very uncomfortable and very noisy. The Green Line itself was a standard RT bus, all over green with raised bullseyes on each side. Now this stood out as different to the others, and people felt they're very exclusive getting on them. The seats were of a latex foam and very comfortable. When you were sat on top of a RT, it was like riding on air. There was virtually no sound, but all you could hear was the wind whistling through the vents at the front, and people seemed to enjoy them.
Being designed for hard work in the centre of London, of course, the much lighter duties of the country area were superb for them, and they were very, very reliable. And they continued until the end of Green London Transport buses, which happened in 1969. This came about because the Greater London Council was given responsibility for London transport, and it was obviously quite unacceptable that they should be running buses in the countryside far from their own area. It was equally unacceptable to the people who were going to travel on the buses, of course. This led to the setting up of an organisation called London Country Bus Services Limited, which was part of the National Bus Company. London Country took over 484 of these green RTs, the youngest of which was 16 years of age, so they did rather well. For a short while they looked exactly as they'd always looked, but then they started to introduce canary yellow as a relief colour with the green. The RTs were pretty rapidly painted into this colour scheme, but equally rapidly they were disposed of because by then they were old-fashioned. They're very small, they only take 56 people. They needed a crew of 2, and they were hopelessly uneconomical, so they were rapidly got rid of. But in the rundown, one or two rather strange things happened. London Transport too found they were short of reliable buses, and very surprisingly they bought 34 RTs back from London Country, painted them red and put them into service, and in fact they actually ran until the last days of the red RTs in London, which came as something of a surprise because London Country didn't look after the vehicles that well.
By the mid-1950s, the RT family had almost completely taken over the London bus fleet. The only exceptions were 2 batches of low-height double-deckers of the RLH class for routes with low bridges, and batches of single-deckers, mostly of the RF type. Between 1950 and 1957, London Transport participated in a number of ambitious overseas goodwill tours, using RT, RTL and RTW buses. These tours promoted tourist travel to Britain and were to establish the red double-decker as a symbol of London. The most ambitious tour was a 14,000-mile tour of the USA and Canada, taking 6 months. All the buses gave trouble-free running and proudly carried GB plates and commemorative notices for many years afterwards.
Now, to the outsider, the fleet remained pretty well standard, but underneath it all, we were doing development for the next breed of bus, which was to be the RM. And to that end, we put on some aircraft braking systems on some RTs at Turnham Green, Hounslow and Reigate. Mr. Durrant, who was Chief Mechanical Engineer for a long, long time, he always believed that we should try and do something to speed the London bus up, because it was a known fact that the speed of London's traffic was really governed by the bus. And he was keen for us to have 2-pedal control, a sort of, not automatic, but a semi-automatic system. So we used the RTs for that. So people didn't see a lot of change in the RT family over the years, but a lot was going on underneath.
Here we are underneath the chassis, and here we have the engine, 9.6 litre engine in its post-war form, with a fluid flywheel attached.
The fluid flywheel is very important because that, in fact, gives a very easy working life to a driver, for the fact that the drive of the vehicle isn't actually engaged until the engine revolutions are built up. So it means that the driver doesn't have to keep dipping a clutch and riding a clutch like he does on a manual gearbox. So it makes for very, very easy driving.
And of course the other things we can see at the front end of the chassis, quite a lot of the air piping to do with the air pressure brake system. And also these smaller pipes here are the automatic lubrication aspect. That's probably a help to you in a way, in the sense that it's one thing less you have to do to grease the vehicle if it's...
Well, that's right, Alan, because in fact there are 24 lubricated pipes which go to all 4 corners of the vehicle, and the system works on a turret rotating inside the head there, which every foot application of the foot brake sends a jet of oil down each one of the 24 lubricator points. So it's a self-lubricating chassis.
It's a good system. It's a major servicing job saved, isn't it, really?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Moving on from the fluid flywheel, because obviously that's the next part of the train, that brings us down to a front cardan shaft, which most people would know as the propeller shaft. That takes us to the gearbox, which is mounted midships on an RT. From the front cardan shafts there are pulley wheels which in fact drive the dynamo, which is over on the near side of the vehicle, which provides power to recharge batteries and for saloon lighting. And over on the off side of the vehicle we've got the compressor, which provides air to operate the pre-select gearbox and air brakes.
Air brakes were something new on motor buses generally. There had been some earlier experiments. Trolley buses had them, but it was something quite new, and the idea of combining the air system to operate both the brakes and the gearbox meant that there was quite a big demand on air supply, and they had to, provide a bigger compressor than was at first thought. But by the time the post-war production RT was on the line, they got all that sorted out.
That's right. Moving on from there, from the gearbox, which is mounted amidships, we have the Cardan shaft leading to the differential and the rear axle. Here we have the cylinders for the air-operated brakes. Coming further back, we have the body riser, which has the platform supports cantilevered off of it and supports the back end of the body. The difference with the RT was that the chassis tail ended just behind the rear wheels, and the back end of the body was supported by the body itself rather than the chassis. Springs here, which are lubricated by the RP lubricator, which we covered earlier. In the country era they had higher ratio diffs for higher running. In the central area they had lower diffs for much slower takeoffs, and obviously they didn't get to the higher speeds that the country buses did. The controls for an RT are very, very simple. The gears, first gear, second gear towards you, third gear to the top, and fourth gear to the back and towards you. Reverse is to the neutral position, then to the first gear, pull out the stop and forward, and you're in reverse gear. Back to neutral. Bus will tick over quite merrily until you operate the operating pedal, which is the left hand pedal, air operated brake and accelerator on the right. Handbrake is mounted on the right on an RT, and the controls for your indicators are to the hand on the right. In front of you, you have a flag which will warn you that your air pressure is dropping, and that gives you several applications of the foot brake before you're completely out of air. Horn conveniently placed on the left, together with the dip switch, and a single speedometer which registers your speed. Basically the controls are very, very simple. The cab heater, a saw for emergency extraction of people under the lifeguards, and the wiper, switches to the left, starter, and emergency handle for the window over the bonnet. The RT cab is a very well designed layout. You can see all corners of the vehicle, you can see to the rear, and if the driver looks round over his shoulder he can see right the way through the bus and can see the back of the bus where it reverses into. The mirrors are nicely placed, good visibility, it's a very comfortable cab. Cab heater for the winter. The door slides open so it doesn't open out, jeopardising traffic coming up from behind. And the cab is a very nice environment for the driver to work in.
We rightly expect all sorts of things of the bus that carries us. We expect the convenience of bell pushes that work, clean, comfortable and well-designed seats, sturdy platforms, firm stanchions, efficient weatherproofing in all weathers, and a smart and cheerful appearance to enliven the urban scene. High standards, particularly when you consider that none of these things wear out and need replacement at the same rate. So in addition to day-to-day care in the garage, after 3.5 to 4 years on the road, every standard bus of the 8,000 in the world's largest unified bus fleet comes into the largest public service vehicle overhaul factory in the world, Aldenham. With a standard design, the inspection of each bus is simplified by standard forms, which become the blueprints for the work of stripping and assembling.
The body was then removed from the chassis. The process involved, first of all, putting the vehicle on an inverter. When the RT was put on the inverter, it was tilted over and the underside was steam cleaned and all the grease and road dirt removed. The vehicle was then lifted by overhead crane and went down a production line called the standings, where each body simply sat on special stilts without any wheels or chassis underneath it. When the body was in the standings, damaged parts were marked up and removed, replaced with new. The vehicle was thoroughly cleaned inside and out and repainted inside and out, or anything that needed repairing was done to the body. The chassis, meanwhile, went down a separate production line, parallel to it, in a separate workshop, on a very slowly moving track, where it was gradually dismantled until it was just basically a frame after having been cleaned off. The units were changed on an exchange basis, and then at the end of this production line, the chassis was silver sprayed and reunited with the body, meanwhile having come down the workshop on an overhead crane. The works were so large that it had its own internal road system, and the bus would be taken in a rather patchwork quilt of colours and so on, maybe green wheels on a red bus, pink primer and so on, and taken for brake tests, and anything that required amending was taken back into the workshop and modified until they were satisfied that the bus met what you would now call their MOT requirements. They were then taken round to a different part of the workshop and prepared for painting, windows masked off, the door area blocked off so that paint didn't go inside the vehicle. It then went through the paint shops with a wet-on-wet paint process, which gave very strong bonding qualities. It was then baked in an oven, and various parts of the bus that were baked in separate ovens, such as removable fittings, bonnet tops and so on, those were then reunited with the vehicle. The vehicle then emerged gleaming at the other end. All the masking had to be removed, and there was then a finishing line, which must have been a wonderful sight to behold in its heyday, because there was a line of shining RTs all pointing towards London, having the fleet names put on with the transfers, having the advertisements put on and so on. Finally, of course, the bus was moved to the licensing shop with its new identity. It was fixed with its licence, and it was taken by a ferry driver to a garage. Sometimes the one it had come from, but sometimes a completely different garage. And bear in mind, this bus, although it's the same bus that went in at the start of the process, might have had a different chassis attached to a different body and with a completely different number on it, so nobody really knew whether it was the bus they'd originally sent in for overhauling or not. And that bus would then go to that garage and be used in service every day for another 3 or 4 years. And it was this quality production line that really ensured that the RT had such a long-lived life. I think without the Aldenham overhauling process, perhaps just doing what you would now call a patch and mend ad hoc maintenance system at garages, the RT wouldn't have given anything like as many years of service as it was in the event able to do.
Another 3.5 years of carrying Londoners in the comfort, the economy and the style to which they're accustomed.
In the 60s and the 70s, when London Transport conducted a very large programme of converting to OPO, as we now call it, one-person operation, then called OMO, one-man operation, but driver-only operation, if you like. Getting the economies of getting rid of the conductors, basically, is what it was all about. Many of the RT routes were then converted directly to DMS's fleet lines, and what went with it at that time was a sharp reduction in scheduled frequency. The thinking at that time was this was the best way to get immediate productivity. So you went from an RT with a capacity of around 56 plus 5 standing up to a fleet line that had a capacity of 89. Wonderful. The efficiency of it was mind-boggling. It wasn't successful. It missed a key point. about bus services, particularly bus services in London, and that is frequency is an extremely important factor. Frequency matters, but reliability, of course, matters as well. So if you cut the frequency and you aren't able to deliver the service reliably, at a stroke, you've worsened the service. Now, add to that the unpopularity of getting rid of conductors, getting rid of the bus that we love. And you really have got a recipe for things going wrong, and they did, because the DMSs were unreliable, there was a staff shortage, the scheduled frequency was cut, and they ran slower because there was no conductor. It wasn't a happy time, and it wasn't entirely to do with the phasing out of the RT, but it certainly came at about the time that the RT was being phased out.
They were, by the late 60s, early 70s, getting run down. The London Transport fleet itself was becoming run down at that time. The Swifts and DMSs had come in, and really I think maintenance was drifting as the engineers struggled to maintain the new types of vehicle with inadequate resources, as it turned out. But most of my time as a garage manager was with RTs. When I was an area traffic manager down at Catford, we had one of the last areas of RT operation at Catford and Bromley. And when the RTs there were finally withdrawn, I thought, well, that's the end of it as far as I'm concerned. I have another 20 or whatever years of working life, and this will be RT less. Then I became manager of the training school at Chiswick. I was actually reintroduced to the RTs there. We kept 2 of them for the skid pan to give demonstrations on, principally. Anyone who's ever gone around Chiswick on an RT on a skid pan will know the thrill of doing it. And this continued until I left Chiswick in about 1980 or 81, I suppose, and that really was the end of my time with RTs.
Between the mid-1950s and the mid-70s, hundreds of RTs, RTLs and RTWs were sold for further service with other operators or as staff transport. In London, the last RTs ran in service in 1979. RTLs had finished in 1968, and London Country sold its last RT in 1981. Fortunately, many were purchased by enthusiasts for preservation.
This bus is RT3251. It was built in 1950, started work as a Green Line vehicle, working from Romford, London Road Garage, and carried on doing Green Line work up until 1965. Then it was demoted to country area work, and instead of the Green Line fleet name on the side, it carried the London Transport fleet name, which was more well known. And it carried on like that until 1970, and with 483 other RTs passed into the London Country fleet, did 2 more years service with them. London Transport had a severe bus shortage in 1972, and with consultations with London Country bought back some of the RTs, and this one I've kept in red London Central area colours, merely to show what the red RTs were like. The aim is to present it at bus rallies and let people see what these buses looked like when they were working for their living.
The RTW, when it was withdrawn from public service, was used quite a lot by London Transport for driver training. The reason for this was that the 8-foot width matched the 8-foot width of the route masters, which at that point in time were gradually replacing all the trolley buses. However, sooner or later they all had to go. The last one left service 1970, that is also preserved. However, the bulk of the class, 279 in fact, were bought by the Ceylon Transport Board, and they were run on service in Colombo, where they literally ran until they fell to pieces.
The RT of 1979 would still have looked very familiar to its designers of over 40 years earlier. It's this familiarity that has endeared it to generations of London Transport passengers and staff.
My interest in RTs started when I was about 8 years old, and I was a bus spotter, like a lot of my friends were. We spotted the bus numbers in little books that you could get to mark off numbers. And people of my generation, we all went to school on them. They were part of our life, and suddenly in 1979 they were gone. And the route master has in fact taken over the mantle of the RT, so if you look around London now, you will not find RTs, and it's amazing that you can go to other places in the world and you'll see RTs running, perhaps carrying fare-paying passengers, but you won't see any in London.
At present, we're operating 3 open-top vehicles, and we are at present refurbishing what will be a closed version of the RT, but the Leyland type. We've decided on a specialist livery, which will now be blue and cream for the open-top vehicles, and I've assumed the closed vehicle will eventually follow this. Originally, of course, they were all the standard service vehicle for London Transport, operating in the City of London. They eventually went off to various owners after their service with London Transport. Number 14 was actually known as the Matchbox bus because it was sold to Lesney Products. Number 15 was sold to the Inner London Education Authority as a mobile classroom. They've been an excellent vehicle, and certainly they've caused a considerable stir through the bus industry and the enthusiasts, of course. Basically because it's a vehicle that had seen its life out within London Transport and been passed over for later vehicles such as the RM, but it's nice to see such vehicles with their excellent design and construction are still able to operate in modern conditions, providing they're looked after properly. This is the company's latest project, number 19, which is a closed version of the RT, a Leyland, which is the rear entrance closed off, the rear staircase removed, a central staircase constructed, and a set of front-loading air doors fitted for one-man operation. We have excellent facilities, and we also have an excellent craftsman who is perfectly capable of doing the work in-house.
Back in the early 1960s, I used to be a driver at Sutton Garage for London Transport, and after emigrating to Australia in 1966, you seemed to miss the bus life, so I returned in 77 and bought this RT 1024.
The RT chassis is 1948 and the body 1950. Both started life as green in the country area. They stayed green until 1969, when they were put together, painted red, and ended up at Battersea Garage before transferring to Sutton, and then a short period at Kingston, where David bought it from.
Last call, E-Line, downtown F Street, J Street. Last call, E-Line.
Hi, I'm Wally Mellon, Maintenance Manager of Unitrans. I'm responsible for the upkeep and repair of the London double-decker buses here in Davis.
Why do you use them?
Because they're very unique to the city of Davis. Davis being a small city with narrow roads, they have the ability to wind their way through the city streets with no major problems.
And what do you do when they wear out?
Wear out? They'll never wear out while I'm around.
Three of the Unitrans RTs are now fitted with Cummins B-Series engines and Allison 4-speed automatic transmissions. In test, they travel comfortably at 65 miles an hour on the freeway, although of course they keep to the legal speed limit of 55, returning 8.5 miles to the gallon with a full load. Only their Saunders RT will be kept with an AEC engine.
How do we come to run an RTL in Cape Town? Well, as many of you will know, 177 of the RT family were bought by Cape Town City Tramways in the early 1960s. 10 by East London, and 1 bus was brought here privately. So that's a total of 188 RT family came to this country. Currently, there are 9 left. 3 of them are sadly in very bad condition. 1 just a chassis, another just a body, and 1 I visited recently in Port Elizabeth is a wreck in a scrapyard. We started in 1991 running the open-top buses you see behind me, which are Daimler Fleet Lines, and people kept ringing up and saying, do you have the Beefeater bus? I didn't know what they meant, but it soon became clear that the original open-top bus in Cape Town was RTL 1394, and it always carried the Beefeater gin signs on the side. Hence, everybody referred to an open-top bus in Cape Town as a Beefeater bus, and even our Daimler Fleet Lines were Beefeater buses. Once we discovered the old bus in Mikey's-Fontaine, we negotiated purchase, brought it back to Cape Town, and what you've seen today is the results of 2 years restoration, and she's now in absolutely magnificent condition. She has a current public service vehicle licence, and she will carry fare-paying passengers.
The RT encapsulates the best of design in buses. It was, to use Frank Pick's phrase, fit for the purpose. It absolutely epitomises it. It was absolutely right for the streets of London, it was right for the passengers, and it was right for the staff. And you couldn't say more than that, and that's why it did such wonderful work for so many years.
For many people, the RT is the classic London bus, which served London for some 40 years and was extremely successful, and in fact was built in more numbers than any double-deck bus for London before or since.